Lastly, let's talk about some of the regions of the Pacific realm. This is a figure showing kind of how they're divided. Goes back a long ways to where some of the first sailing explorations out into the Pacific. We have Melanesia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. And I'll explain kind of those in a moment, but this is an old kind of sailing chart showing how people kind of, how European explorers kind of conceived of and divided up these spaces in the Pacific. We have kind of the Malaysian region of Southeast Asia, Melanesian, which here they're including Australia, Micronesia, and Polynesia. Okay, so Micronesia, and these mean kind of the black islands. Micronesia means the tiny islands, and Polynesia means the mini islands. And so let's start with Melanesia. It includes Papua New Guinea and the other islands in the zone. The reason why they're called the Black Islands is kind of a racial thing, because the people were dark complected people. So it was this kind of Europeans kind of describing something about the people who live in there. Slightly kind of racist, but that's where the name comes from. Primarily Papua New Guinea here. So this is part of New Guinea Island. And New Guinea Island is not truly an oceanic island, but it is included with Melanesia because there are some people from kind of this area kind of explored out and have some, and it gets included with what we kind of chop up as Melanesia here. Now, that being said, one thing about Papua New Guinea, if you look at these, it's the biggest island. So in the Pacific realm, Papua New Guinea is the biggest country. It is an independent country. It is most populated, about 9 million people, which isn't a lot, but compared to these little tiny islands, it is the biggest. Actually, it has 8 million, and then about 1 more million people live in the rest of these islands in Melanesia. So Melanesia is the most populated, including with 9 million, including most of those living in Papua New Guinea. So it's the big island of this realm. Micronesia are tiny islands. These are mostly low islands, mostly atolls, very tiny islands that are scattered about north of Melanesia. One island that I'll highlight is Guam. Guam is a US territory here in Micronesia. Then lastly, we have Polynesia, kind of a variety of islands. Some might, that sailing chart included New Zealand, but really it's kind of traditionally kind of a triangle from New Zealand up into the Midway Islands, down into Easter Island. One prominent set of islands here that are included in this are the Hawaiian Islands, which are a US state. So even though we covered North America, including the United States, one of our states, the Hawaiian Islands, is way out here in Polynesia. Right, so this is a Guinea Island here. Half of it belongs to Indonesia. Half of it is Papua New Guinea. And this is Papua New Guinea. This is kind of a satellite type view of Papua New Guinea compared to Australia. We talked about Australia being relatively dry and desert-like, and where Papua New Guinea up here is actually much more mountainous and very tropical and wet. So this is kind of a mountainous tropical rainforest zone compared to its neighbor down here, which is much more dry and less mountainous. In fact, in the real highlands of New Guinea, you can even have small glaciers because of the height of the mountains. So this is a view of Papua New Guinea, very tropical environment, very mountainous. Very rich in biodiversity, like we have in the Amazon or Central Africa, because of their, again, tropical rainforest. All right, and this is a figure from the book kind of showing the Pacific realm. I'm going to blow it up a little bit so we can see a little bit. And what I want to highlight is that many of them have a little parentheses on the end, like Northern Mariana Islands, US, Guam, US, Hawaiian Islands, US, Cook Islands, New Zealand, New Zealand, Pitcairn, sorry, UK, United Kingdom. The point being that many of these islands are administered by other powers because they're so isolated. It's often hard for them to become independent and be self-sufficient, simply because they're so the sheer distance from the rest of the global economy. So when we talk about colonization, well, many countries in Africa and Latin America and other places have become independent over time. Island countries, particularly those that are scattered into the Pacific Islands, are some of the last ones to not gain their independence. They're often microstates, very tiny populations the size of maybe a small town, like 10,000. And they're dependent on other countries for their survival. So they've been, compared to other parts of the world, these are some of the last places that are slow to gain their independence. And one last thing on colonization as well, that if we look at, if we kind of consider the United States and Japan getting into a war in World War II, sometimes there's a conception of like, why, when they're so far apart from each other, what were they fighting over? And this is a figure showing right at the beginning of World War II what the colonial situation was. Japan actually controlled many of these islands out in the Pacific in red, whereas the United States controlled these in blue. And so what you're kind of seeing is that the United States and Japan, while far away from each other, when it comes to their island colonies, were kind of butting right up against each other. And that's kind of what led to attacking Hawaii. And then most of that battle in World War II against them were fought along these islands in the Pacific. And this chapter also includes just a couple of slides on Antarctica and the polar region, North Pole region. Antarctica is not an independent country. It is a kind of an area that has claims by multiple countries, including Argentina, which is down here in the south, Australia, Chilean, British, and so on. And so there are these claims. However, no single country controls Antarctica. One country missing from this list is the United States. The United States does not have any claim on Antarctica, but one thing the United States does is it does a lot of research in Antarctica, has multiple research going on for climate change and other things. And in a way, that's a sort of a soft diplomacy, that because the United States has researchers working all around Antarctica, it would be difficult for any other single country to come in and sort of try to assert power, take it over. But the United States doesn't have any official claim on it, but it does operate all around there. If you look at these dots, the research stations are all around Antarctica. The situation in the polar regions can be a little bit more, in the North Pole region, excuse me, as opposed to the South Pole of Antarctica, can be more dicey. One country in particular, Russia, is very far north in the world and is the country that kind of wraps around very close to the North Pole and has been very assertive in trying to assert control. In fact, this is an undersea robot planting a little Russian flag at the North Pole. And I'll include a video that kind of talks about these polar regions and Russia's increasing influence in them. And lastly, I want to include this figure because it shows something we've talked about, is the migration of people into the Pacific. Now, bear in mind that during the times of the sailing ships of the Portuguese, Spanish, and then the British Empire, British sailing ships, came to places like Hawaii fairly recently, and we're kind of in awe to discover how are all these people in all these islands? How did they get there? And there have been various theories. People have kind of proposed that maybe people kind of just drifted there by accident, but really it was the development of early sailing and navigation technology by the Polynesians who kind of pioneered their way out into places like Madagascar, New Zealand, Hawaii, and all the way not only to Easter Island out here, but even possibly all the way to South America. And I'm going to include a kind of a short, some segments of film that explain some of that technology, because it is a really, this is a really amazing feat of early human engineering to develop the sailing and navigation technology to conquer the Pacific centuries before the Europeans made it out here on big, on their what modern sailing ships.